You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 350, Signing the Constitution. And for the past few weeks, we've covered the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. We primarily looked at the powers of Congress that made up Article 1 and the powers of the executive, which were laid out in Article 2. This week, we're going to go through all the rest of the articles in one bang. I think Article 1 was by far the most important topic of debate at the convention. Article 2 received a considerable amount of debate as well. The rest were debated, but not quite as much, so I think it'll be a little easier to go through all of them. Article 3 of the Constitution established a federal judiciary. The convention came to this after considerable debate. At the beginning of the convention, the Virginia plan called for the judiciary to be chosen by the legislature and to hold offices during good behavior. The New Jersey plan called for a federal court to be chosen by the executive, but didn't see the need for any sort of trial courts. In debate, the delegates generally agreed by consensus that there should be a court to hear certain matters. Some delegates opposed the idea of creating inferior courts, arguing that state courts could handle most cases, and that needed appeals could go to the federal Supreme Court. Roger Sherman of Connecticut, John Mason of Virginia, and John Rutledge of South Carolina spoke in favor of leaving trials all to the state courts with only an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. Nationalists like Madison, however, wanted a complete federal court system to try issues that specifically involve federal law. The convention ended up punting on this issue. The Constitution itself established a Supreme Court, but it left it up to the U.S. Congress to decide what inferior courts, if any, should be established. After some debates, the delegates determined that federal courts would have jurisdiction over issues that involve federal treaties, collection of federal revenue, impeachment of federal officers. They would also handle admiralty cases where a foreigner was a party to the case. Later, the delegates took away the power of trying impeachments, leaving that to Congress. They also added that the federal courts would handle cases that involved disputes between the states. The selection of judges was also a matter of debate. Although Madison's Virginia plan initially proposed judges be selected by the legislature, the convention rejected that idea pretty decisively early on. Madison then pivoted his arguments at the convention to giving appointed power to the president. This ended up being included in the larger debate over the appointment of federal branch officials. In the end, judicial appointments ended up being the same as all other appointments. The president would appoint and the Senate would confirm. In the colonial era, many judges were appointed by crown authorities and sat at the pleasure of those authorities. Most Americans did not like that practice, since it made judges dependent on those who could remove them. In fact, one of the reasons for breaking with Great Britain in the Declaration of Independence was, quote, "The king has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries." And to help protect judicial independence from political leaders, the convention opted to give judges lifetime tenure. They gave some consideration to judges having a term of office, but the general consensus was that judges might try to curry favor if they had to be reappointed at some time. Delegates also explicitly noted that judicial salaries could not be reduced during their tenure in office. After all, if you could just reduce the judge's pay to almost nothing, that was essentially the same as firing him, as most could not afford to stay on as judges without pay. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania proposed giving the executive the ability to remove judges, subject to some confirmation by Congress. Sherman supported this, but several others who had actually served as judges, men like Rutledge and John Randolph of Virginia, argued that the power to remove judges for political reasons would simply destroy judicial independence. In the end, the convention decided that removal of judges had to be only for the same standards as removing the president, that is, issues of treason, corruption, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Removal would also require a 2/3 vote in the Senate to prevent factional majorities from misusing the impeachment process. James Wilson of Pennsylvania advocated to give judges some power to review new laws. In Britain, a council of jurists could block a new law from taking effect. This would ensure that all three branches had some say in laws before they went into effect. Nationalists like Madison disagreed. Judges were supposed to be the arbiters of the law. If they had a say in making the law, that would bias them when cases questioning that law came before the courts. When I talked about presidential powers last week, I neglected to talk about veto authority. Much of the veto discussion involved either using judges or some special counsel to review and veto laws. In the end, though, they ended up giving the power to the president. Many argued that a veto should be absolute. The king in Britain had the power to veto any law, and that would be the end of the discussion. Although several delegates, including Wilson, Hamilton, and Morris, supported this idea of an absolute veto, opponents argued that it gave the president too much power. They allowed for a provision that Congress could override a veto with a 2/3 vote in both houses. So if Congress overwhelmingly supported a measure, the president could not stand in the way. Delegates also debated the idea of judicial review. Should judges be able to strike down an unconstitutional law? Gouverneur Morris and Madison, as well as others, argued that that was a pretty inherent power of judges. Madison used the example of ex post facto laws, that is, making something a crime and then convicting a person who committed the act before it actually was a crime. The Constitution clearly barred that, so if Congress tried to create an ex post facto law, the court certainly would not enforce it. Others, like John Dickinson, argued against this power. It could be subject to abuse, giving judges an effective veto on all laws. In the end, the final language did not explicitly address the question either way. However, only a couple of delegates ever spoke out against judges having this authority. For the most part, the convention did not get into the details of defining any crimes. The one exception to this was treason. Delegates feared that factions would arise so that those in the majority would just accuse their political rivals of treason. Under British law, treason could mean a whole range of things that generally displeased the king. The framers tried to avoid that by explicitly defining treason as making war against the United States or giving aid and comfort to its enemies. At Ben Franklin's suggestion, conviction would require the testimony of at least 2 witnesses or a confession in open court. Further, punishment of treason could only apply to the individual, not to his family, another break from British custom. So, the 3 branches of government were set up in the first 3 articles of the Constitution. At least that's how the Committee of Detail ended up organizing all these powers. There were still other things that needed to be covered. Article 4 would cover how states interacted with each other. One was a requirement to give full faith and credit to decisions by other state governments. This actually came from the Articles of Confederation, which used the term full faith. They just added and credit. The Constitution also guaranteed that citizens would be entitled to the privileges and immunities of citizens in all states. The 4th article also raised the issue of a person charged with a crime in one state who fled to another state. The Committee of Detail inserted this, noting that such a person would have to be returned to the original state for trial. The New Jersey plan had included something similar, but it just really hadn't received much debate during the convention itself. Once this provision was inserted, however, it touched off a debate that had been avoided through much of the convention, and that is the issue of slavery. In 1787, only a few states had begun the process of ending slavery in their states. But several states in the South, particularly South Carolina, were nowhere near ready to give up that institution, and they wanted to make sure that the Constitution would not interfere with slavery. 2 delegates from South Carolina, Pierce Butler and Charles Coatworth Pinckney, moved that slaves or indentured servants who fled bondage to another state must be returned to their masters in the original state. Now, delegates from the free states were not ready to use the Constitution to outlaw slavery altogether. They knew that trying that would just blow up the convention and prevent probably all of the southern states from remaining in the Union. Even so, James Wilson of Pennsylvania objected to a constitutional provision which meant that the federal government and possibly other free state governments would have to spend money and resources trying to return slaves. The government didn't do that for horses or cows that fled their owners. Why would it have to do that for slaves? In the end, though, Southern delegates were adamant. Near the end of August, Butler moved to insert a clause that anyone held to service or labor in one state and who escaped shall be delivered up to the person claiming that service or labor. The convention agreed to this clause without a vote. There's speculation that this was part of a larger compromise on other matters that were added on that same day. The delegates included a clause allowing Congress the authority to admit new states based on whatever criteria they wanted, but it did make clear that new states could not be taken from the jurisdictions of existing states unless those states agreed to the matter. This was pretty uncontroversial, considered first in early June, and never got much debate or dissent. To the extent there was some argument, it was mostly over the claims to Western lands that some larger states might still assert. Delegates eventually decided it would be up to others to decide the legitimacy of those claims. That didn't have to be addressed in the Constitution. The delegates also added a clause allowing Congress to make laws for U.S. territories that were not part of any other state. This was already what the Confederation Congress was doing in the Northwest Territory. The delegates just added a proviso that this could not be used to prejudice any claims of territory by the U.S. or its states. The delegates also debated the insertion of a clause that the federal government would ensure that each state maintain a Republican form of government and protected the existing laws of each state. Gouverneur Morris objected to this idea, raising concerns about, say, some of Rhode Island's laws that seem to threaten basic property rights. Should the U.S. government commit itself to protecting such laws? In the end, delegates changed the wording to ensure that each state did have a Republican form of government, meaning one elected by the people, not a monarch or oligarchy. They left out any protection of existing state laws, but did guarantee protection to each state against foreign invasion or domestic violence. And this was probably a direct response to the recent Shays Rebellion in Massachusetts and the inability of the Confederation Congress to do anything to restore order. Elbridge Gerry asked for a provision that the state government had to give permission for a federal intervention, and after some debate, the delegates agreed to that. Now, the convention also tackled the subject of amending the Constitution. The Articles of Confederation had required unanimous consent of all states to make changes. This had proven impractical. The Virginia plan had proposed that all amendments be proposed by the national legislature. As representatives of the people, this made sense to many. This didn't get much debate until late August, after much of the other issues were resolved. When it did, some delegates argued that it should not be Congress, but rather the states that would decide when a constitutional amendment was necessary. A resolution by John Rutledge called for the application of 2/3 of the state legislatures to call for a new convention to discuss changes to the Constitution. That was essentially how this convention had come into existence. During the debates in September, the Committee of Style argued about who should be able to propose amendments. Gerry and Hamilton wanted Congress to have the ability to propose amendments. After all, they were the ones working under the Constitution and would most keenly feel the effects of any flaws. Others were concerned that if the states were suffering, the federal Congress might not be willing to make those necessary changes. In the end, the convention agreed to 2 possible ways to propose amendments. One was with a 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress. The other would be if 2/3 of the states called for a convention to propose amendments. Once an amendment was proposed, at least 2/3 of the states must consent to it. Given some concerns about minorities being overruled, this was changed at the very end of the convention to approval by 3/4 of the states. Now, there was still some concern. Smaller states remained hesitant that amendments might be used someday to take away equal representation in the Senate. Eventually, the convention agreed that no state could ever be deprived of equal suffrage in the Senate without its consent. Again, although outlawing or protecting slavery really didn't come up as a debate at the convention, there was another issue that the South Carolina delegation was concerned about, and that was the federal power to prevent the importation of slaves. They wanted protection against that federal power. After all, the federal government had the power over imports and exports in and out of the country, and so importing slaves would fall under that power. The overwhelming majority of delegates disagreed with any protection against the federal power to regulate the importation of slaves. That was an issue that was going to have to be left up to Congress. South Carolina, however, was adamant. In the end, they came to a compromise that Congress would have no power to block the importation of slaves, but only for the next 20 years. The convention also debated the repayment of debts. The Virginia plan had included a resolution that the new Congress would take on all engagements of the Confederation Congress. Now, there was little debate that the new government should continue to repay its war debts incurred by the Continental Congress. After all, the need to find a way to repay those debts was one of the reasons that many delegates wanted this new government in the first place. Now, there was, however, some debate over whether the new government should assume all the war debts that the individual states had incurred. So, for example, if Virginia had raised funds during the war to protect the defense of that state, the Congress would take over the repayment of those debts. In August, Rutledge put forward a motion that would allow the government to take on those state debts. A pretty large faction of delegates, however, opposed this measure. Many states had made great efforts to pay down their debts already. Jerry made the point that states with relatively small remaining debts did not want to have the burden of paying down the debts for states that really hadn't made much effort to pay down theirs yet. Butler objected to paying the debts at all. He noted that speculators had purchased most of these notes, and he had no interest in paying off what he called, quote, bloodsuckers. Although it's not in the record of the convention debates, Hamilton, who was a strong supporter of assuming state debts, spoke with Madison about this question outside the convention. Hamilton later told people that Madison agreed that the government should assume state debts, but had decided to leave that to the new administration to settle, and not put it in the Constitution. In the end, the Constitution only said that the new government would repay the debts from the Confederation Congress, and it remained silent on the matter of state debts. The final article proclaimed that this new Constitution would be established once the conventions of 9 states ratified it. Now, this was actually a pretty drastic step. Remember, originally the convention was supposed to make recommendations to be approved by the Confederation Congress. Such amendments under the articles had to be unanimous. In this process, the delegates simply ignored the Confederation Congress entirely and sent it to the states. It even bypassed the state legislatures, calling for state conventions of the people. They further required the effective support of only 9 states, a 2/3 majority, before the Constitution went into effect. That was a lower standard than was even required for amendments to this Constitution. The process made clear that the convention was not just recommending even radical changes to the articles. It was establishing an independent process to replace them without the consent of either the Confederation Congress or the state legislatures. By early September, the convention delegates were exhausted from nearly 4 months of nonstop negotiating on this new document. Up until the very end, there were arguments over various clauses. On Saturday, September 8th, the convention appointed a committee of style to draft the final version. William Johnson of Connecticut served as its chair, with other committee members being Alexander Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris, James Madison, and Rufus King. Morris actually did most of the actual drafting. He wrote the preamble, beginning with "We the People," and made most of the final wording choices. The committee brought back the final document the following Wednesday. Even at that point, after all the debate, the delegates argued for the last-minute changes. The last significant change made at this time was to reduce the congressional override of a presidential veto from 3/4 to 2/3. The committee then printed copies for everyone the following day for final review. Many delegates were still not happy. Elbridge Gerry, Edmund Randolph, and George Mason said they would not sign this document because it lacked a Bill of Rights. The delegates spent the rest of the week reviewing the final document to make sure that no one had snuck in any other changes, but no further changes were made. On Saturday, September 15th, the convention gave its approval to the final wording. The convention paid $30 to Jacob Salas, an assistant clerk for the Pennsylvania State House, to draft and engross the final document. The document was written out on 4 pages and was ready for signing the following Monday, the 17th. Now, many delegates were still unhappy. There was a question as to how many of them would sign the final version. Benjamin Franklin was asked to give the final remarks. Franklin wrote out a speech, but he was too sick to stand and address the delegates. Instead, he handed his speech to James Wilson, who read it for him. Franklin conceded that the Constitution was not perfect and that he could not get everything he wanted. But the compromises they had made were the best they could produce as fallible human beings. Franklin pointed out that any government would rely on the people who would administer the government to ensure it would work. He hoped it would be well administered for years and that it would be a long time before the people became so corrupted as to need a despotic government. Delegates must rely on the people and the officials who would make up this new government to make it work. Franklin ended by noting that he raised his complaints about parts of the Constitution during the debate, but with their work done, he would support the final product and not make public anything that he thought should be different. He urged the delegates to sign this imperfect document as the best men could produce, and he hoped that they would all work to see it ratified. Gouverneur Morris called on the delegates to sign, not to imply approval of everything, but simply as witnesses as to the unanimous consent of the states present. In the end, 38 of the 41 delegates signed. Mason, Randolph, and Gerry still refused. A 39th signature, that of John Dickinson, who had to leave the convention due to illness, could not be present to sign. You may recall that Dickinson had refused his chance to be part of history by signing the Declaration of Independence. He wasn't going to miss out on this one. He authorized fellow Delaware delegate George Reed to sign on his behalf. The delegates signed, grouped by states. Alexander Hamilton wrote the state names at the bottom of the document, and each delegation signed under their state. With their work complete, the delegates went home. Next week, we're going to see what the country thought as the people get their first look at this new Constitution. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, Michael Mulhern, and Mitchell Anderson. Thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Patrick LeBeau, and Kurt Avard. I appreciate everyone who supports this show, either through ongoing contributions or one-time gifts via PayPal or Venmo. This week, we finished off the Constitutional Convention. I thought that before we left the convention entirely, it might be interesting to look at a few of the failed proposals from the convention. I mentioned in the main episode that there were efforts to assume state war debts that were shot down, and the assumption of these debts would in fact be completed by Congress a few years later. There was also a proposal by Charles Pinckney to establish a university in the new federal capital. This proposal was shot down by a vote of 4-6, with people like Gouverneur Morris arguing that it was unnecessary. Congress's power over the federal district already allowed it for such a venture, and that should be left up to Congress at a later date. So that was left out of the Constitution, but sure enough, Congress did establish what eventually became known as the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And Madison had pushed for Congress to have the power to grant charters of incorporation for multi-state projects like canals. When the Committee of Style was making its final changes in mid-September, Franklin moved to add a few more words after the authority to establish post offices and post roads to provide for the building of these canals. This hit opposition by those who thought the federal government should not be on the hook to pay for projects that would benefit only the local regions. In the end, the proposal failed by a vote of 3-8. There were repeated efforts to give the new federal government the power to void state laws. Madison and Wilson were big proponents of this. Others feared that this would give the federal government too much power over local matters and might cause some states to object to the Constitution entirely. In the end, it was left out. Now, because federal laws did get supremacy in the Constitution, the federal government could still make laws that would overrule state laws, but the federal government was not going to sit as a board of veto over all state laws that were ever passed. George Mason also proposed the power to enact sumptuary laws. This would give government the power to prevent people from spending money on luxury goods. Such laws were seen as a way of preventing the kind of extravagance that they saw among aristocrats in Europe, and that really disgusted most members of the Constitutional Convention. They wanted to encourage economy and frugality. A committee was created to consider this option, but the committee never issued a report, and the matter just kind of dropped. The delegates also debated giving Congress the power to select the treasurer of the federal government. This was seen as a way of putting a check on the executive to make sure Congress was in control of how money was actually being spent. The proposal made it into the first draft of the Constitution, but it ended up being removed by the Committee of Style at the very end. The majority thought that the treasurer should be appointed by the president just like all other federal officers, and that the Senate's power to give consent to these appointments was enough of a check. The final Constitution prohibits the government from impairing the obligation of contracts. There was also a proposal to prohibit states from doing the same thing. The rule against giving the federal government the power to enforce this restriction on the states was rejected. Delegates also debated the idea of giving the federal government the power to set up requirements for voters. In the end, this just became too controversial, as states had very different standards for voting and would unlikely agree to any sort of national standard. In the end, voting standards were left up to the individual states. Of course, the federal government did end up implementing some federal standards through constitutional amendment, the 15th Amendment prohibiting states from denying the vote based on race, the 19th Amendment based on sex, the 24th Amendment prevented the states from levying poll taxes, and the 26th Amendment prohibiting age discrimination after the age of 18. The convention considered a land requirement for presidents, senators, and judges, and it would have banned any debtors from holding any federal office. Most states at this time had land ownership requirements, especially for the upper house. This was designed as a protection so that poor people did not get into these offices and try to take property away from the rich. Men like Pinckney, Rutledge, and Gouverneur Morris liked the idea of a property requirement. Franklin, Madison, and others opposed it. In the end, they dropped all land requirements, and most states that actually had a land requirement for state officials ended up dropping them over the next few years as well. This was a trend that was on its way out. Madison pushed for a federal power to prevent states from laying embargoes. These had been one of the most powerful tools that the colonies had used against Britain. Madison wanted to keep that power at the federal level only. This hit heavy opposition. Since the power of the federal government to regulate commerce was already granted, many saw this prohibition as unnecessary and divisive, and in the end they dropped it. At several points, the delegates debated the insertion of a Bill of Rights, particularly the right to a jury trial. Due process by a neutral jury had been one of the fundamental complaints against British rule. There was also a pointed effort to protect liberty of the press. The delegates generally opposed defining these rights, since it might lead to the idea that these were the only rights that the people had. The states had done a good job of creating bills of rights, and those would not be disturbed by this Constitution. So in the end, they dropped the idea of the Bill of Rights, despite a vehement minority objecting. And we'll see during the ratification debates that this actually became one of the biggest criticisms of the Constitution as proposed. My book recommendation this week is Witnesses at the Creation, Hamilton, Madison, Jay, and the Constitution by Richard Morris. The three men named in the title are the authors of the Federalist Papers, which we'll be getting into soon. But the book itself covers the years leading up to the Constitution. It spends very little time on the convention itself, and then moves into the ratification debate. So this is not a book if you want to really focus on the convention itself, but it helps put the convention into a better historical context. The book itself was published in 1985. The author, Richard Morris, was the Gouverneur Morris Professor of History at Columbia University. Richard Morris, however, is no relation to Gouverneur Morris. Richard Morris died in 1989. If you want to take a quick look at the book, I've included a link to a borrowed copy that is available on archive.org. I'm going to go off topic for my online recommendation this week. PBS Nova put out a great episode recently on the arms of the Revolutionary War. It's available as a full episode on YouTube, and I think it's one well worth watching. I've included links to it on my blog and website. My question this week comes from Jason Dallas, who asks, what were the grooming standards of Continental soldiers in general? Were beards and mustaches allowed? Wigs or no wigs? I've seen conflicting information about this and wanted to see what you think. Well, Jason, in the 18th century, beards were not considered acceptable. Certainly no gentleman would have one. As we know from all the portraits from that era, pretty much everyone was clean-shaven. The one exception was Hessian soldiers, who frequently had a mustache but no beard. Continental soldiers generally followed the grooming requirements of the British Army, which required that all soldiers shave at least once every 3 days. General von Steuben instructed officers to inspect their men for standards, requiring combed hair and, quote, their beards be close shaved. Now, I'm not sure if this meant that very short beards were acceptable or whether this was just the general's weak grasp of English. It was not possible to enforce these standards, though. After Washington's retreat across New Jersey, author Charles Wilson Peale noted coming across a soldier wearing just a blanket and having a long beard. He did not recognize that it was his brother until the man spoke. There were also notable campaigns where it was noted that the men did not shave. Reports from Arnold's Wilderness March across Maine and Greene's Race for the Dan in North Carolina both noted that men grew beards because there was no time to shave. The fact that this was noted shows just how unusual it was to have a beard. So while beards were considered inappropriate, they did exist when soldiers did not have the time or ability to groom themselves properly. Americans generally did not wear wigs. British officers did, but not enlisted men. A few wealthy Americans had them, but many wealthy Americans did not. George Washington never wore a wig. He, like many, simply powdered his own hair. Most men tended to wear their hair long and braid it in the back and tie it with a ribbon. Officers did tend to have longer hair. Shorter hair was acceptable for farmers and tradesmen who made up the enlisted ranks, but a proper gentleman would have longer hair. Soldiers were issued flour and tallow so that they could powder their hair at times. Now, much like with the beards, whatever the standards were, they were often ignored, as most soldiers did not have the ability or resources to groom themselves to the acceptable standards. So you'd see a wide range of looks depending on the conditions at the time. Officers seemed to make more of an effort to groom themselves, but even they often came up short. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on X, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.